Welcome to my talk on behalf of SANS Secure Your Fortress, and I have something serious to discuss this time. Normally people know me because I talk about OSINT a lot, I talk about practical tools and tips, but today I think we need to discuss something that has always been important, but maybe now with what's going on all around the world has become more important. So I want to talk about vicarious trauma, and I want to talk about how we can address the impact and how we can implement, or you and your company, or maybe you alone, can implement some practical solutions. So before we do that, for those who don't know me, I need to introduce myself real quick. My name is Nico, Nico Dekens. Some people know me better by my username or handle, Dutch_OSINT guy. I'm an All Source Analyst. I worked for almost 25 years for the Dutch government as an Intel analyst. Currently, I'm an instructor at SANS for the SEC 497 course, which is a practical open source intelligence course, 6 days. And I'm the co-author and instructor for the 587 course. That's the advanced open source intelligence and analysis course. I used to work at Bellingcat real brief as a project manager, and currently I'm fulfilling a role of Director of Intelligence and Collection Innovation at Shadow Dragon, which is an open source intelligence tool provider coming from the US. But enough about me. We need to have some real talk here. So my real talk here is that OSINT investigations, so open source intelligence investigations, can cause you as an investigator very severe trauma. And this is something that's rarely, if not at all, talked about. And it's also highly underestimated by many people, especially in my book, by leadership within companies, but also by the practitioners themselves. So this is why I think it's so important for me to talk about. Because let's face it, a lot of us open source intelligence investigators and journalists, we expose ourselves to all the horrors that this world has to offer. War, conflict zones, child abuse, terrorism are just a few of these subjects that we have to look into on a daily basis very often. And each of these subjects receive a lot of attention by online investigative enthusiasts and experts like you and me, but also from just curious people around the world who heard something on the radio or watched something on TV, for instance, and then go searching on the internet. So those people may dive right into looking for stuff online while getting exposed to serious traumatic images, videos, and sounds. So in consequence, people like you and me can get exposed to something that medical experts call vicarious trauma. And this is what my talk is about. Before we dive into some practical tips and things, do's and don'ts, I think it's good to explain a little bit what vicarious trauma is. So vicarious trauma, VT, is often referred to as secondary traumatic stress, STS. And it's a form of trauma where someone who tries to help, in this case, we could be considered as helpers because we are highly motivated to make the world a better place, which means that we will not hesitate to look into certain very disturbing topics. And with that, we are trying to help by finding information, collecting information, and turning that into actionable intelligence. But we are also exposed to material that can cause very serious trauma. And trauma very often is very hard to reverse. If not, it's irreversible. So we get exposed to these scary, horrific, and maybe sometimes even life-threatening and deadly events that happen on the internet, or at least that get exposed on the internet. And for example, by seeing wounded people or scared or dead people on videos or pictures, they can get under your skin without you noticing that. And if you do this long enough, or if you don't pay attention, or if you don't have, let's say, the right things in place, you could get traumatized for a short time, a longer time, or even for life. And yeah, I know we want to seek the truth. I know we want to help, but you also need to take care of yourself. And this is why I think vicarious trauma is one of the most overlooked and underestimated things within open source intelligence investigations. And this is why I wanted to talk about it. Now, when you look at this and when you look at my personal experience, for example, when I was working in the Dutch government, I spent more than a decade looking into counterterrorism cases, so Islamic State, things that went on in and around Russia or other conflict zones. You can only imagine with that, you will see things that you can never unsee. Same counts for if you're working in the child abuse or child pornography teams for those who work at maybe law enforcement or in government. It's very important that you know and acknowledge that what you do and what you see is not normal. Normal, average Joe people do not get exposed to this type of content on a daily basis. So, things you may notice about yourself that you may be getting traumatized, or if you maybe already have been traumatized in the form of vicarious trauma, is that you feel an overwhelming amount of sadness in your life, grief. Maybe you're more irritated than you would normally be. So you're a little bit more stressful. You have more of those mood swings. One of those significant things that I've heard from numerous investigators that I know from all around the world, insomnia, not being able to sleep due to the work that they've done. Maybe even in combination that while you can sleep for a short time or a long time, that you may experience very horrific nightmares. Another thing that you may notice or may notice in your direct network, because this is also something we need to look out for each other, is social withdrawal. So not willing to communicate with others in real life, not willing to go out, maybe even having forms of aggression. So you get angry out of nothing for no reason, and you cannot really declare what's going on. In general, being way more sensitive to violence than you normally would react to certain situations or other things. Being super cynical. I've noticed this myself when I've spent almost 2.5 decades in government. You basically always get to see, let's say, the ugly part of humans or the ugly part of life, which made me very cynical about life. And let's be honest, if you take 100 people, not all of them are bad people with bad intentions. So you need to put things in perspective again. Some people may even experience sexual difficulties due to having vicarious trauma, being exposed, being traumatized due to the work what you do. So these are just a bunch of these signs that you may have a form of vicarious trauma or that you may have been traumatized due to the work that you do or the information most of the times in the form of pictures and videos and audios that you've exposed yourself to that got under your skin without you knowing this. And this is something that you must be aware of. So if you have any of these signs, well, please get a checkup, talk to someone. Or if you notice that someone in your inner circle, maybe one of your fellow colleagues, is showing signs that are pointed out here, you may want to step in and say, hey, how are you doing? Can we talk? Take a cup of coffee. Let's discuss. How are you feeling? Now, when you look at this, it also makes it easy for you to be exposed to this because in my personal experience, a lot of open source intelligence investigators often work alone from either their home office or in that cubicle at the office. So they are somewhat isolated. There's no, let's say, real team checkup. And since we have that goal to find that nugget, to solve the puzzle, we are highly motivated. So it makes us work with, let's say, eye caps on, narrow down vision. We are not always aware of the fact that we should every now and then take a step back or put things in perspective or unwind a little bit. So we spend maybe days looking for certain content. Well, for example, in my example, looking for that terrorist footage with the most horrific scenes. I remember vividly I had to look at decapitations. I had to look at child abuse cases. And that's something that is really hard, particularly if you have the combination of moving footage and audio, where you can hear those horrific sounds when someone is being murdered very brutally. It gets to you. And maybe initially it doesn't, or maybe for some it will never happen, but it's something that we should be aware of because it will stick to you. It will get into your mind no matter what you do. Now, there are other things that we need to talk about when it comes to this. There are some things that that we can do. But before we do that, I want to talk briefly about a real life example. So, when I was investigating the Islamic State terrorist groups during their high rise, I was continuously looking for new terrorist cells, footage of foreign fighters, to identify threats as well as suspects to my country, the Netherlands, as well as Europe and other places around the world, because it was honestly, it was a global effort by people who practice what I like to call OSINT for good to keep the world a safer place. So it was my job to watch hundreds and hundreds of hours of people being killed, set to fire, being tortured, and other brutal war propaganda. And that was during the high rise of the Islamic State. And keep in mind that for me as an investigator, I had nearly 24/7 exposure to that horrific content. Why? Well, at that point, I was still working at the government, so I came into the office, let's say at 8 o'clock in the morning, had my morning coffee, started searching, doing my analysis in open sources for 8 to 10 hours, saw murders, saw brutal footage, blood everywhere, weird sounds, and then I drove home in my car. I turned on the radio, and on the radio and the news, they were talking about these terrorist attacks in Belgium, or they were talking about terrorist attacks in the United States, or lone wolf stabbing attacks, or other things that the Islamic State at that point was doing. So for me, that information flow never stopped. Because normal people, or normal, maybe normal is not the right word, or average people who do not investigate like we do, they go to their office, work for 8 or 10 hours, go home, but that's where it stops. For me, the information flow never stopped. So I drove home in my car, I got home, and I started watching some TV. But again, the 8 o'clock news or primetime news was also talking about what was going on. So my brain, my eyes, my ears were constantly exposed with all these horrific events. And this got to me. And I didn't notice it until some of my fellow colleagues noticed that I was getting agitated way more often than I would normally be. I noticed myself that I had problems falling asleep. And every now and then I noticed that I got nightmares, or at least dreams that were definitely about terrorism kind of things, horrific things. So that made me very aware of the fact that I should take a step back. And this is where I was at least comfortable with letting leadership know that I did not feel comfortable at that point in time based upon the work that I did. I wanted to take a step back. And that made the company aware about certain things, which I will get to in just a moment. But just telling you that this is what's happening. And when we look at, for example, the war in Ukraine with Russia now, a lot of people are investigating that. There's a lot of horrific content coming out of there. But also do not forget the October 7 attacks on Israel, where Hamas did the most horrific things. And a lot of people are investigating that. So with that, you need to be aware of the fact, yes, you are most likely doing great work in investigating these things, but do never forget about yourself. You might be impacted and you might get traumatized. So there are some things that you can do about it. So what can we do about that? Well, when you look at that, a normal person, an average Joe again, does not get exposed to, let's say, child abuse, terrorism, murder, or other traumatic events on a daily or weekly basis. Most open source intelligence investigators will be exposed to that way more often than an average Joe or Jane, which may turn you into a burned out person, or may show that you have that, again, that social withdrawal. You may have that insomnia, or just in general, that cynical, skewed worldview. Because again, let's be honest, not everybody's a criminal, not everybody is a terrorist. There's only a fraction of the world that does horrific things. But when you, let's say, submerge yourself so much hours and weeks and months in those worlds, that kind of becomes your reality. And that reality may again traumatize you. So how can we prevent being traumatized? What can we do? What can you do to prevent from being traumatized? Well, there are some strategies. My main takeaway here is you need to prevent that certain images or footage stick to your mind forever. or that will traumatize you in such a way that you need help or even come to that point that trauma is irreversible. So I've had fellow colleagues that literally had to stop what they would do or step out that anti-terrorism unit because they just couldn't take it anymore. It was too much for them. And I know a lot of people who worked at child abuse cases or child abuse cases that needed to step away and they were no longer capable of doing that because they were so traumatized. So prevention is the key here. Trying to prevent from being exposed to this horrific content. Now, tips that have worked for me consistently. I like to turn off audio. So when I'm watching a video of, let's take again that example of Islamic State, where I needed to watch that someone was being decapitated while a lot of people, bystanders, were watching that decapitation. My goal was to identify bystanders or people that were maybe foreign fighters that we knew about. But I needed to watch the video. And you can only imagine if someone gets decapitated with a knife that there will be some horrific sounds coming with that. But also the sounds in general. So if you turn that off, the impact becomes less for you and your brain. It simply enters your brain and your sensors differently. Another thing that really helps, specifically with pictures or moving footage, videos in general, if you have a capability to turn that footage into black and white, so from color to black and white, it's less impactful. You can only imagine if you can see the color of blood or other things, it sticks more to your brain when you compare that to only having to view that in the black and white corals. Another thing that really helped me is take regular breaks. Now, some of you may be thinking, hey, but I'm only allowed to take the 10 o'clock break, my lunch break, and my afternoon break. But this is where you have that professional role. Talk to your leadership. Hey, you want me to investigate terrorists. You want me to investigate child abuse cases. I need breaks. I need to step away from that computer to relax my mind and maybe talk at the coffee machine for 5 minutes with a fellow colleague about something super innocent. The music you like to listen to, holiday you want to go to, just those low barrier chats that you have here with your colleagues. So step away from that computer and that computer screen often. Another thing that really helps, if you need to watch something that's really horrific, do not do it alone. Watch it together, because in that way you can immediately talk about it and discuss it and bring a little bit more of nuance to what you are watching, so it will no longer really stick to your brain. Another thing that can really help, if you're watching, let's say, again, horrific content in a video, go outside, because once you go outside, maybe in a park or in a parking lot, you get exposed to sounds from the outside. Things are just wider. And if you watch something on a phone screen versus, let's say, a large computer screen, the impact for the human brain and eyes is just less. So again, you're helping to prevent yourself from getting traumatized or less traumatized by making sure that the impact that it might have is as least as possible. Again, you need to try and keep your work and private life separate. So for example, when I was doing counterterrorism work, it was pretty hard because it was all over the news, almost 24/7. But if you have that capability to really separate that work from your private environment, do it. Because again, that will give you time to relax, to unwind. And another thing that really helped me, and this is something that I wanted to get back to. So I told you that I was doing counterterrorism work, and some colleagues pointed out to me that I was getting a little bit more irritated very often. I was getting insomnia. But what really stood out for me is that one moment in time, I was visiting a museum with my family, and a big commercial sign fell over, which caused a very loud bang. And that bang somehow triggered me. That bang made my mind think that there was a terrorist attack going on in that museum where I was visiting with my family. So I jumped on my kids to try and protect them. And this is where I personally became very aware of, hey, you're now getting so paranoid, so let's say unrealistically paranoid, that you might get traumatized. So I went to leadership and said, we need to talk about this. And this is when we at Dutch law enforcement implemented a mental health checkup for certain teams. So if you're in the counterterrorism team, child abuse, Other murder cases, you had a regular bi-monthly checkup with a psychologist just to make sure that you are doing okay, your colleagues are doing okay, and just make sure that you have a program. Because if you have someone that is in that early phase, you can still prevent getting really traumatized by having the proper policies and proper mental health checks in place. So that really has helped me from a personal perspective and tips wise. So, but the biggest takeaway for me always has been be human. Just be like a human. Do not ever act tough. It's okay to say, hey, I've had enough for today. I've seen enough. I've heard enough. It's just too much for today. So it's okay to show your emotions to yourself, to your colleagues, to your loved ones, and to leadership. So you need to set those boundaries. You need to set those personal boundaries. How far am I willing to go when it comes to this? But how far should you as an employer let your employees go when it comes to certain investigations that are very sensitive or that expose your employees to very horrific or potentially traumatizing content. So that's something that I would really like to encourage for those who are in a leadership position in a company, or if you're just an employer, discuss this with leadership because it should never be underestimated. So to close this off, one last slide. My conclusion is vicarious trauma is real. Do not ever underestimate the effects of being traumatized by doing your investigations. Use those tips to prevent getting traumatized. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough, employers have a responsibility to their employees to make sure that they do not get traumatized. And more importantly, you know yourself best. Listen to yourself, but also listen to your loved ones because they will tell you when they are noticing a difference in your behavior. And don't wave it away. Just make sure that you do that. Now on top, in this slide under the word conclusion, you will see a short link, bit.ly /VC-OSINT. That will take you to a blog that I've written some time ago that goes a little bit more into detail into my talk. But again, I think vicarious trauma is something that we should talk more often about, but also we should not be ashamed of talking about and having more policies in place. That being said, I want to thank you all for paying attention to my talk for the SANS Secure Your Fortress momentum. And if you ever feel the need to reach out to me or touch base, my credentials are on the screen. You're all probably people that are maybe interested in OSINT, so you should be able to find me. And please take care of yourself. Thank you and goodbye.